Hello everyone, today I'll be going over the Benko Gambit, and like all of my other videos, this gambit was suggested by one of you guys, so here's the comment on the screen right now. So thank you for suggesting this comment or this gambit, and if you guys want other videos, suggest them either in the comments or in the form in the description. So let's get into this gambit, and one thing about it is it's a very solid gambit from Black's perspective, because you just have similar developing moves in every line, and you'll see that as a main theme in the video. You just have these, couple of moves that you do no matter what, which is very nice in an opening, especially if it's an opening that you want to play often. So it starts in the queen's pawn opening with d4, and then you go ahead and take out your knight to f6, and you see the normal variation of the Indian game. And now you play the Benoni defense. If you're not familiar with the Benoni defense, you are free to watch a video that I cover it. So if you need that video, it will pop up right now on the top of your screen, so you can find it there. I would highly recommend watching that video first before coming and learning about this gambit. So you play this move here, and now usually your opponent pushes forward. In the other video I covered, what happens if your opponent takes. But this time we're going to cover what happens if your opponent pushes forward. So it works well with the other video. And now you go ahead and play b5. And this is now the Benko Gambit, with the idea that, first of all, your opponent doesn't have to take the pawn, right? With every gambit, it's not forced. It's an option that you're giving your opponent. But let's say your opponent does take the pawn, because with any other move, you can take the pawn. You can support the pawn. It's just a very free position. So with every other move, you feel pretty comfortable. And now, so this video is going to cover the variations where your opponent takes. So your opponent took the pawn, and now you have a couple of options. But the only move that you're going to look to play is a6. Notice that this seemingly nice a5 move just doesn't work because of knight c3, and it defends the pawn and it blocks the check, so it doesn't work in this case. So you should be looking out for these nice kind of forks, but in this case it doesn't work. So you're going to play a6 like I mentioned, and now there are many options. I'm going to be covering 3 options, but don't worry if you're going to be like, oh, I can't remember 3 different lines. They're, for the most part, almost identical, especially the position you reach after. So first I'll cover the option that you take, then I'll look at the option that you push the pawn forward, which is also common. It doesn't give you this open file, so it looks kind of stupid. You're pushing the pawn to a place where it can be captured and it's not protected, but it doesn't give you this open file, so there is a benefit. And the final option I'll show you kind of works if your opponent plays any other move, but specifically I'll be looking at the move e3, which kind of enforces or puts protection on the pawn here on b5. So first we'll talk about the variation that your opponent takes. Oh, I have no idea what that line was. So if your opponent decides to take the pawn, you go ahead and take back with the bishop, obviously, and you don't need to take immediately. You can play some other developing move, but quite frankly, I think it's nice. You're developing a piece on your queen's side, which eventually wants to move. You cannot fianchetto the bishop or anything, so the bishop is gonna move around the board a little bit. So it seems fitting. You could also take with the knight or the rook, but the bishop is just one option, and I would recommend it. Also, with the bishop, if your opponent ever looks to playing e3 or e4, once there's maybe a knight here reinforcing e4, you can grab the bishop here, and your opponent won't be able to castle, which you'll use a lot, right? A king is very not safe if it's in relatively in the center squares, so you can use that to your advantage. Now notice the biggest thing that you've done. You're down a pawn, but you've removed both of your pawns here. So you can use these semi-open files, and eventually you want to get both of your rooks on the B and the A file, right? So you want to move this rook over once you've castled. So now I'll go ahead and slightly mention the ideas that you have, because I mentioned that it's a very kind of strict policy of what you're going to be playing with this opening, what developing moves you're going to play. So I'll mention it. You're going to want to play d6 first of all, and notice that your bishop is going to be very sad now. So you're going to go ahead and play d6 with the ideas of fianchettoing the bishop, moving the knight to d7, where the pawn was, because the knight, can't go here because of the pawn, and it can't go here because of the bishop, so you want to develop it. And move the queen somewhere along this diagonal. It doesn't really matter, so either, c7 or b6, for example, work well. And then you go ahead, you castle, and you swing over your rook to the open files, right? So it looks very messy, but I'll help you kind of learn it with an example. So let's say your opponent plays a developing move. Like I said, you just have these steps that you want to be taking, right? So if your opponent plays all these moves, then you go ahead, you play, these moves that I'm talking about, and again, you've done already a lot of them. You have your queen to move, you have your rook to move, and then you're going to be theoretically in the Benko Gambit completed in the developing moves, right? You can go ahead and move the knight here and maybe put some pressure on this pawn, and I showed it, but actually I would prefer to leave the knight here for now and play a move, either queen to c7, like I said, or queen to b6, essentially moving the queen onto this diagonal here, where it doesn't interfere with the rooks. So once the queen is out of the way, maybe they move their rook to the center file, and then you have completed development with swinging the rook from the f file to the b file, where now both of your rooks are eyeing down this queen side, where it's all semi-open files. So it's a nice position to have. A little secret that you might, that might come into the play later on is that there's a couple of traps, I guess. If your opponent moves, their queen, for instance, then you can always, and their knight, then you can always, this bishop can serve a purpose, especially with the rook not defending it, and the knight kind of a double attack with the rook and the knight. It can definitely serve a purpose. So you might want to eventually look out for that. But the main thing that you're going to be wanting to do is to eventually push this pawn, and notice that your queen eyes down this pawn here. So with the help of a knight, you can actually put a lot of pressure on this pawn here, and it's not always obvious. With the fianchettoed bishop, the knight has a really nice spot here. Any time that you fianchetto a bishop, usually your opposing knight can have a fairly happy position over or under, depending on which way you look at it, under or over the pawn. So it's going to be nice here. And again, like I said, you can have that little attack with the queen. Additionally, you're always just putting a ton of pressure on this queen side, also with the help of this bishop. It's a very positional gambit. Now let me show you some other options that you might have, but don't worry, they're very similar, like I mentioned. If your opponent pushes forward, for instance, you capture with the queen, and notice eventually you did want to move the queen out. So you've already done some of your developing moves, only in a different order. The only difference now, however, after they place the moves, the only difference now is that your rook here, it's not anymore in a semi-open file because both of the pawns are on this file. So that is one disadvantage, and maybe you want to instead move this rook to the b file eventually and keep this other rook that will eventually be on the f file, keep it somewhere in the center, the e file, the d file, anywhere where it could just be a controlling rook. So that is maybe one disadvantage if your opponent pushes the pawn forward. So understand that. Now let's say they play a move like this. Notice they can play this move as the knight does a nice job supporting it. You just normal developing moves. You can fianchetto the bishop, and from here you just have ideas, fianchettoing the bishop, castling, and like I said, swinging the rook over to one of these files. You're going to want to take out the bishop. The bishop doesn't, move out, which is another disadvantage. So you're going to move out the bishop. Maybe here it could be nice, and eventually you could, you could redirect it, or even maybe eventually you want to, make this breakthrough and capture back with the bishop, because eventually it could be worth it. Also, you can always play this move, but then the knight is a little sad because you want to, move the knight there. So after you move the knight here and maybe you play a move like this, you can castle, or you've already castled, you can swing the rook over to these files and this rook over here, and it's still a very controlling game. Notice you'll still have the same idea of attacking with the queen and the knight, and so it's still a very positional game with a lot of secrets, I guess. Let's look at the third option. Once again, very similar. If your opponent instead plays a move like this, and this option fits for really any move, but specifically we'll look at this move. You capture, your opponent captures back with the bishop, and now you have this very similar idea of what you've done last time. And that's a similar theme that you'll notice. This pawn here, however, is now very weak. So eventually, your bishop, instead of maybe moving here like the first variation, it's probably going to want to, move here. So once you play a move like this and capture, your bishop has a nice spot like last time. So you're going to play this move. Knight could go here. You could fianchetto the bishop, castle. Now you again have these nice open files or semi-open files for your rooks to harass the opponent. And your queen can always move along this file. Once again, your queen cannot go here. It's a nice idea, but the tactic doesn't work with this knight move here, protecting the bishop. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have any other kind of openings that you want me to talk about, gambits, anything, leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.